Welcome to Fair Observer Live, our signature panel discussion that brings together diverse views from around the world. This discussion is part of a series hosted jointly by Fair Observer and the United Service Institution of India, or USI, as it's properly called. Fair Observer is an independent, non-profit media organization that has published more than 2,500 voices from over 90 countries, including statesmen, retired military officers, former diplomats, and leading professors, along with some of the brightest young public intellectuals from around the world. Our partner, USI, was founded in 1870 by Colonel, later Major General, Charles McGregor for the, quote, furtherance of interest and knowledge in the art, science, and literature of the defense services. With almost 13,000 members, USI is by far the top defense think tank in India. I'm Christopher Schell, your moderator. I am a contributing editor at Fair Observer and partner at Fair Observer Intelligence. Also with us is General Sharma, who will be joining us a bit late, one of the great strategic minds of India and director of USI, our partner institution. Another very distinguished officer of the Indian military is Air Marshal Khosla, who retired as Vice Chief of Air Staff of the Indian Air Force. We are also grateful for Manu Sharma, who is a fellow contributing editor at Fair Observer, an economist, a psephologist, and public policy wonk. Finally, last but not least, we have Atul Singh, founder, editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, and our fearless leader. So I want to start off with Air Marshal Khosla. More than half of India's major naval vessels use Ukrainian gas turbine engines built by Ukrainian gas turbine engines, and that the Indian Air Force relies on Ukraine to upgrade sizable fleet of transport aircraft. Is India risking such supplies?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christopher. First, let me thank Fair Observer and Atul Singh. Can you hear me properly?
Loud and clear, sir.
So thank you, Atul Singh, for inviting me, and thanks to USI and General Sharma also to put me in this very distinguished panel and opportunity to express my views on a very important subject, and most important to learn from the interaction. And I must say the views which my personal views, and it's got nothing to do with Government of India or the Indian Air Force. I've retired 3 years back. The subject is very, very important. If you allow me, Christopher, I'll just take 2 minutes to put few things in perspective before I come to your question specific. So it's a very important subject, the crisis which is going on, and in the broader sense, it's got effect on a lot of facets. The nuclear angle, the economy, the multilateralism is under reconsideration, the trade, economic warfare. Alliances. There's a lot of this thing. Now, in the midst of it, the Indian stand. So that is, I think, baffling everyone. What sort of a stand is this? Why aren't we joining one camp or the other? Actually, we are doing a tightrope walk. And there are a lot of factors. There are a lot of compulsions. There are a lot of reasons. So it is very important that we understand why India is doing what India is doing. And so in that backdrop, I think we should progress. So I'll just take 1 minute to put few things in perspective. One is, the historical imprint. India is a very old civilization, and, the era of colonization and the Cold War has got a lot of imprints on us of various types, and that really affects our decision making. The Indian policy has been, starting from Panchsheel, non-alignment, peace-loving. There's no aspiration to, go outside our country. It's just our interest we want to safeguard. And keeping this backdrop in mind, I think all our policy decisions are based on this. And strategic diversity is our hallmark of our diplomacy. The Indian approach, you are well aware of, we have been abstaining in the various votes. It amounts to not joining any particular camp and basically looking after our own interests. But our policy of disengagement is based on, UN Charter and the contemporary global order based on the UN Charter, respect for international law, sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, and we've been contributing to human relief as well. Okay, so just one more word about our compulsions. You're well aware of, we have got two nuclear powered inimical neighbors, and the Pakistan is following the policy of bleed by thousand cuts. 3 wars they have fought, smaller ones, skirmishes, I could say, Kargil and Siachen. China has been very belligerent lately. Their attitude is thing, and more than that, we are facing a collusive threat with the both neighbors joining together. So in this case, it is not a question of A or B. It is a question of survival. It's a matter of survival for us. And we need weapons, we need technology, we need arms, we need capacity as well as military capability. We need to look after our interest of security, not only military, economic, as well as energy security. So keeping all these things in mind, I think in this backdrop, what decisions we are taking is, I think, better understood. We can talk about it more later. Now, coming to your specific question, Christopher, why is India risking it? Well, this is not the first time we are facing the similar situation. Way back in 91, when USSR broke up, we had a similar situation. We had contracts with the USSR, and suddenly the defense industry were divided between various countries, and the whole supply chain was disrupted. And that time our N32 aircraft was going through upgrade, and the whole project went haywire, the timelines. And we learned a lesson. And not only then, in the Cold War period, repeatedly things would pop up. So like any other country or any other logical steps would be, steps were taken for short-term, mid-term, as well as long-term. So in terms of, review of supply chain, in terms of our stocking policy, so that short-term, in case, you can tide over the shortages by having a more stocking policy. Then alternate sources and multiple sources for various components and supplies. Then indigenization of components at a fast pace, so that whatever we can indigenize, so that we don't face problems. I mean, these are all short-term and mid-term. And the long-term, of course, impetus was given to the self-reliance. That is the ultimate solution. Also diversification, although it's a logistic nightmare, but in this situation, it becomes a boon rather than a bane, that diversification and having multiple taps, I call it, so that even if one tap closes, the others are available. So these steps were taken, and they are reviewed periodically. Notwithstanding this, it will affect our availability of various arms, ammunition capability. But I think we will tide over it by these particular steps and all. And I don't think it's a risk as such. Steps have been taken, and we should be able to, it will slow down our process, but we should be able to tide over. Yeah, thank you, Christopher.
Well, pursuant to that, particularly in the context of the Quad and even broader alliances that are developing, do you think that this will lead, in terms of future steps, because you talked about that, this will lead to greater opportunities for Western defense companies? And so, read that as cooperation.
Yeah. What I'd say is that I wouldn't say that in those many words like you spelled it out. But what will happen is, of course, see, what is happening now is we're spending money. And for the reasons which I told you, we've got two inimical neighbors, and we need the belligerent attitude of, another neighbor is visible. And in this scenario, we need to rapidly build up our capacity as well as capability. I'm talking about military at the moment. Okay. And even at the cost of, the debate goes on between whether butter or the gun. Even with the cost of development, we need to spend money on this thing. And in these circumstances, if we are, cutting down on our development and spending money on defense or the military capability, I think any person would like that we get maximum bang for a buck and the value for money. And it's a competitive bidding. And if you're spending money on it in the cost of our development, we would like to have the latest technology. We'd like to have the latest equipment. We'd like to have a competitive bidding and a process where we select equipment which suits us, which meets our requirements and which is modern enough and it is high technology content. And the contract helps us in, transfer of technology or standing on our feet or whatever you want to call it. So keeping these factors in mind, I mean, future acquisitions will also continue in a similar manner. So what will happen is anyone who is for whatever equipment we need and comes into the competitive bidding will be able to, if he makes a grade, will be able to supply. Now coming to, in case the Russian bloc or the whatever you want to call it, defense industry goes into a tailspin, and it may give opportunity to the others indirectly. That's what I would say. And the vacuum could be filled by others. And whether the Russian defense industry will go into tailspin and or not, that is a different story altogether. And we got dealings with Russia as well as Ukraine, the contracts. But obviously, these contracts will suffer. The future procurement will suffer because for some time at least, till the time they recover and things come back on track. So I would say indirectly, it may create more opportunities. But once again, as per competitive bidding, and the results could come on that. Yeah, Christopher.
Thank you very much, sir. Manu, why isn't Western pressure working?
Well,
I suppose a way of clarifying that is what. Go ahead, sir.
You see, there are three core reasons why I would say that the Western pressure so far isn't working. The first reason being that the pressure is not being applied, simply put. West itself is divided as to how far it should go in pursuit of Russia. Now, this division stems from the internal political equations in the respective countries. So, for example, in US, you have this MAGA versus progressive Democrats debate, in which essentially the two sides are pulling in 180-degree different direction. And then you have the Macron versus Le Pen election going on, whereby depending upon the electoral results, we could see drastic changes in the French policy towards what's going on in Ukraine. So all in all, what we are seeing is that the West itself is quite divided as of now. It may appear by the sheer weight and the sheer brilliance, or I would say viciousness in some manner of the kind of sanctions that were used against the Russians. But ultimately, the sense of solidity is not there. That's the first point. The second point is that so far, whatever the pressure has been or whatever the calls have been from the Western establishment, the sense or the perspective in India is that materially, India is being asked to give up a lot. For example, access to various space technologies, defense technologies, and even some cyber capabilities by ditching Russia. Now, India needs access to those frontier, or I could say near frontier dual use technologies, but it doesn't seem that they are forthcoming, at least from the public statements. Something may be being discussed behind the scenes, but so far that's not the case. So first, there is internal division in the West. Second, India is being only offered the stick, not the carrot as of yet. And the third is a very important point, which is about the internal political stability in India. Particularly from the case of EU, what we've witnessed is that there are some very divisive political debates within India. There has been this Citizenship Amendment Act. There was a recently concluded farmer agitation. And time to time, there are these questions or allegations about human rights issues within India. Now, the perspective of the Indian establishment is that they constitute some kind of a non-tariff barrier. That, as the foreign minister Jaishankar said, that the West tries to put India into this Goldilocks zone, whereby they are okay with India doing well in, let us say, developmental sense, which is poverty reduction, which is about gender rights, which is about climate change. But the moment it goes beyond the developmental realm and it just ventures into the strategic field, which is military industrial complex, which is space technology, which is heavy industries, over there, the Western support dwindles. And it is in this zone that Russia becomes critical. That is where the West drops the ball, Russia picks it up. So it's very hard for India to completely abandon its interests in the strategic domain without, being offered an alternative.
So that's interesting. The way you concluded, where the West drops the ball, Russia picks it up. What would Western powers need to do to have India more aligned or join the Western camp?
Well, for one, there have to be some kind of confidence building measures or confidence building, I would say, deals, which may include, offering something on the lines of what was offered to the AUKUS. Much has been said about the Quad, but in real terms, I would say AUKUS, which comprises of the Australia, New Zealand, and UK, and the US, is a far more potent alliance than Quad can even think of as of now. So the West needs to provide more teeth to its policy. They need to offer something more substantial. Maybe, since I'm not a military person, but from what I can gather is that Indian military is far more closely associated or we can say working with the Pentagon. And maybe, if we have the Indian Navy acting as a confidence building bridge between the US establishment and the Indian establishment, that could be a beachhead. That could be a starting point. But we need to have a showpiece confidence building measure out there before, India can be asked to say, okay, you know what, you can live without Russia in the strategic domain.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Atul, why are relations between Russia and India still close? We've heard some discussion of that, but perhaps you could address that directly.
Oh, well, perhaps I will use the Manu method and give you an Oxbridge answer. Since he went to Cambridge, I better parrot him. Otherwise, I let down my institution, I suppose. Joking, gentlemen, ladies in the audience. I'm not being serious. I can't help being a bit facetious and lighten the seriousness of the tone of this discussion, not the substance. So, number one, history.
Particles all the flat unraised spirits.
Exactly. Take them to the great sunlit uplands. So, number one is history. Number two, of course, we have geopolitical needs. I wouldn't even call them considerations, needs. And number three is strategic military reasons. So number one, history. Now, even before independence in 1947, a lot of Indian leaders were very influenced by the Soviet Union. Remember, India was ruled by the British East India Company. The experience of capitalism in India was rather traumatic. It led to famine and poverty and whatnot. So Indian leaders were naturally attracted to socialism. The Soviet Union cultivated them, particularly the Soviet Union cultivated Jawaharlal Nehru and later his daughter Indira Gandhi. So that was one reason that early on a certain tenor was set. And then America didn't help itself by conducting coups in Iran and interfering in Vietnam. And the worst thing in strategic terms that the US did was side with a military dictatorship. Pakistan was then a Cold War ally. So it sided with the military dictatorship ruling Islamabad, which was conducting genocide and using rape as a weapon of war in Bangladesh. Now that memory, my father served in the army. My father is a bit older than Air Marshal Khosla and General Sharma. And my father fought in that, served in that war, and he constantly talks about it till this day. And so that scarred the Indian psyche. Then during the Afghan Jihad, a lot of US money that came to Pakistan was diverted by the inter-services intelligence into operations in India. So they fomented insurgency in Manu's state, in Punjab. Later, of course, once Afghanistan fell, Kashmir became the focus. And all this time, the US was rather soft on Pakistan because of course, even after 91, because of Cold War ties. And as a result, India felt that it would get rapped on its knuckles for human rights abuses in Kashmir, but Pakistan would never even get a chiding for anything it did. Now, things have changed lately, but that has scarred the Indian psyche. Recently, of course, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan has left a bitter taste in Indian mouths. The US walked away, leaving a mess on India's doorstep. And India questions whether the US is committed to the region. So there are historical reasons all through that come up till today. Then, of course, as I said, there are geopolitical needs. Russia has always backed India on Kashmir, something India has not been able to rely on, whether it comes to the US or the UK. France has been a better ally in the UN Security Council, but China is certainly not an ally in the UN Security Council. So let's say there's a resolution which is unfavorable to India that is going through the UN Security Council. Who do we rely on to kill it, to veto it? It's Russia. So our geopolitical needs are such that as a fragile democracy in a rough neighborhood, we need all the friends we can get. Russia has proved to be a loyal friend over many decades, and before Russia, its previous avatar, the Soviet Union. Ipso facto, despite deepening ties with the US when it comes to investment, trade, people-to-people exchange, our students coming over here, and so on and so forth. Despite all of that, India continues to cultivate Russia. There's also the China factor when it comes to the geopolitical needs. As per some estimates, 70% of our military equipment is Russian. Now, the number could be more or less. I'll not get into it. But the key thing is, if Russia should turn against India, in the event of a war with China, we would be in a bit of trouble. That might not be a jolly good idea. So, because of our geopolitical needs, we have to keep cultivating Russia. Now I come on to the third reason, which I foreshadowed, military and strategic. We get a lot of equipment from Russia. We have a lot of equipment from Russia. The equipment from Russia that we have needs spare parts in case of war. That's critical. The equipment that we buy from Russia is often cheaper. Russia offers us the option to indigenize that equipment. We can slap on our technology, something that the Americans and even the French don't allow. Of course, Russian equipment is cheaper. I've already said that. There's also the issue which Air Marshal Khosla talked about, and Manu also talked about, which is of transfer of technology. When India became independent, it didn't have the scientific and technological base and the experience of fighting World War II in the same way as, say, the US or USSR. Of course, Indians had served in World War II, but they had been soldiers. Few of them had been officers like General Manekshaw and General Bhagat, but most of them had been soldiers. So we didn't have at that time the technological base to build missiles, to create a nuclear program, to have atomic energy. Now, all of that, India invested in, India created, and India relied on help from the USSR and now Russia. So cutting edge technology, the transfer of technology is something that India needs. And even when Putin made a brief visit last year, he opened a factory for AK rifles in UP, my ancestral state. So when it comes to military and strategic needs, India relies on a lot of Russian kit. Yes, as you rightly asked in your very first question, it also relies on some Ukrainian kit. And India has a very delicate tightrope because India has to get stuff from Ukraine too. But India relies more on Russia than on anyone else. And so for military strategic needs as well, India still cannot just cut loose from Russia. It's tied because of history, as I said, geopolitics, and military/strategy.
And I understand that, but necessity aside, I mean, is Russia a declining asset as a partner? I mean, increasingly they're viewed as an international pariah. Could India potentially pay a price for its erstwhile neutrality?
So that's a great question. Is Russia a declining asset? It has been since the 1980s. The Soviet economic system clearly didn't work. Socialism in its Soviet form failed. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, most people forget, who are younger, is that's when we had our balance of payments crisis. So obviously, Russia is a declining asset. It has been for decades. India is rebalancing. Look, India has deeper ties with the US. India has deeper ties with the EU. India is cultivating France. India believes in a very close relationship with Japan. Of course, there are cultural issues. The Japanese are always on time and we are always only 2 hours late. So, the beginnings of the culture clash. But we are trying our best to rebalance. And our markets for our growing economy are primarily non-Russian. But having said that, there's a phrase in Hindi, which I'll translate for you, "Mara hua hathi bhi sawa lakh ka hota hai," which is even a dead elephant is worth 125,000. So Russia may be a dead elephant, not just a dying elephant. I'm not saying Russia is a dead elephant. My Russian friends would kill me. I don't want to be killed yet. But the point is that Russia is still valuable and India has no choice but to stick to it. Having said that, I don't think we'll pay a price. Remember, India survived sanctions after it went nuclear. At that time, Jaswant Singh, who was a mentor of mine, who actually was one of the people who wrote my green card recommendation. He was the foreign minister of India, and I used to have long talks with him. And of course, he negotiated with Stoke Talbot and yada yada. And India did suffer briefly, but India is far too important right now in the long term to the US, to the EU, to the West, given the rise of China, given, more importantly, the growing market that it has. So, given that fact, I think there'll be a bit of a bumpy ride. There'll be a bit of a, lover's tip, but they'll have to kiss and make up. Particularly, remember, the West itself is divided. And come November, you might have a very different Congress. So it might be a very different ballgame in Washington, D.C.
Well, as a dead elephant, I have another question. Do we have General Sharma with us? I can't see here.
We do.
He's muted.
Yeah, he's there.
Muted.
He's there. He's there.
Okay. We'll come back to General. The General. Air Marshal Khosla, what are the strategic lessons that India is drawing from this conflict?
Yeah. Actually, there's a strategy. I mean, there's not much of new lessons. These lessons are oft repeated in the world when various wars or disagreements or skirmishes, whatever you call it, take place. Before I come to the strategic lessons, we talked about trust. The major problem at the moment is, I wouldn't call it trust deficit, because we have made progress on various counts with the West as well as US, not only militarily, but in a whole lot of other areas. I call it, trust quotient. So we need to increase the trust quotient. Sanctions we talked about, the other fear is, if you rely totally on one country for your military and other needs, in time of need, like 1971, you've seen in time of need, if the tap closes, then you're nowhere. So as I said earlier, diversity or diversification is a problem, but it's boon at times. So that is one fear. Second is, duplicity. Pardon my using this word, but that is also, leaving some scars, like our adversary or the inimical neighbor, Pakistan. The weapons and arms are being propped up. He's being propped up, and these Western arms and equipment is reaching there. Although, as a partner in the terrorism war, but the same weapons get used against us, like the recent Balakot skirmish, F-16s and AMRAAMs were used. So that is second issue, which, creates a doubt about the trust quotient part of it. So it's a question of once bitten, twice shy. So as far as strategic lessons are concerned, one is that country like India will always get pressurized to join one camp or the other. So we have to, have our relations, we have to have our diplomatic process in such a way that we don't come under situations where we have to do tightrope walk, and it's easier said than done, but we need to look into that. Second is, this thing that nobody will come and fight for you. So it's very, very evident from this also. I won't Ukraine, although support is being given and various this thing, but actual fighting has to be done by you. So you have to build up your own capability. You have to build up your own capacity. You have to build up your own deterrence value. And for militarily, as well as whatever means, by other means. So what I'm getting at is that you have to be strong to save yourself from your enemies. And as I said in the beginning, that we have two neighbors who are not very friendly. Okay. Then third thing is, in the world, I mean, all the engagements are changing. I mean, it was earlier also, but now it has become very prominent in the terms of all engagements are interest-based. Your self-interest is first, and then comes other things. So, and it's an acceptable norm that I may be okay with you on these A, B, C, D, 5 issues, and I may not be okay with you on another 3 or 4, 1, 2, 3 issues. And that is absolutely acceptable. So I think joining one camp or the other, the pressure should not be there. Then last and most important strategic lesson which has come out in India is that militarily you have to be self-reliant. Technology as well as equipment, as well as weapons, arms, and that is very, very important. Having said that, I feel that US or the West should understand the Indian position from this perspective, accept that issue-based approach and not rely only on black and white, either this way or that way. There are shades of gray. So accept that these shades of gray are there, and various diplomacy as well as alliances form in these shades of gray. Build up the trust coefficient. And most important, I feel that US should empower India to deal with the domestic and international situations both. It's a win-win situation for both. And, with transfer of technology, with the technology infusion and the things like that. Build up the strategic partnership without imposing their, ideas and interests, and honor the strategic sovereignty of the country. And there is a lot of mutual benefit areas of convergence. I think there's so many of them, and we have been working on it. I think we should work on those and move forward, and without dictating who can be our friends and without dictating whom to buy equipment from. I think that should be the bottom line. And with these recommendations or with these actions, I think we can move forward, and it will be a win-win situation for both countries. Yeah. Christopher?
Yeah, I can.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Thank you, sir.
Christopher, you can hear me?
There you are, sir. How are you?
No, I was there very much, but probably I was muted. So, yeah.
No worries. Glad to have you. So I may I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Sir? Okay. What happens if the Russian economy tanks and its military industry collapses? We've talked about spare parts. We've talked about technology. What would that mean for India?
If you permit me, I would like to first give a little bit of perspective, listening to the debate that is already, I think we're doing a lot of speculative thinking here. There has been one-to-one virtual meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Joe Biden, followed by 2+2 meeting. And I think both sides have been able to very clearly articulate their respective positions, right, during those meetings. So India has explained its position very clearly. And I think there is a degree of recognition from the US side why India has taken the course that it has taken. So I don't think that there would be any intimidation, any threats or anything of that nature. And I had discussions here very recently for some top-notch American thinkers, and they were very pointed in saying that Ukraine crisis is not going to impact Indo-US relations. It has taken a certain trajectory. It has tremendous potential. And therefore, let's not miss wood for the trees and go ahead with whatever our relationship is. India is a very big country, and based on our historical experience and our geopolitical interest, we made a very conscious choice of doing certain actions in regard to Ukraine crisis. And that has a total political consensus in this country, which is further echoed by the nation as a whole, the people as a whole. But that doesn't mean that we are supporting what Russia has done in Ukraine to change the status quo or the killings at Bucha and things like that. But we are looking at inclusive security of all states. I mean, India was never consulted by United States or NATO in regard to expansion of NATO or deployment of those weapons or the way they dealt with, Russians that side. So today, why should India be held accountable for certain actions, reactions which took place in the last few decades? We have our own strategic interests. And if you look at our strategic interests as a rimland state in Eurasia, I mean, if we have to be a player of substance in Eurasia, we need to align with Russia. Otherwise, we will de facto give whole of Eurasia on a platter to China. So there's a larger geopolitical interest there. And I think it is also in the interest of US that India plays the role of a balancer as much as it does in Indo-Pacific, as it should actually do in Eurasia, right? So that's a larger issue. Now, I think this is a very hypothetical question that if Russian economy tanks, if you look at the fall of ruble and its recovery, I think it is already to pre-war level, its recovery. And there are a lot of sort of inbuilt capacities in Russia to bounce back because they are not a banana republic. They have a huge industrial complex. They have a lot of energy resources. There are countries who want to do business with them within CIS states. There is a next door, a China, which by all, if you go by the purchasing power parity, it's already overtaken United States of America. And they are going to be the #1 guzzlers of energy in the world. India is #2. So I don't visualize that it is a kind of a, because of this Ukraine crisis, Russia is going to tank and there's going to be a very serious crisis in Russia. Probably what Russia is now looking at is it's reviewed its political and military objectives, and it is well within its means to achieve those as long as it is able to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea side, Sea of Azov, is able to create that land corridor through Mariupol into Donbass region, and probably have some kind of a de facto control along the Dnieper River, and take a commitment from Ukraine that they will not be joining NATO or the European Union, at least in the foreseeable future. And with that, I think while we may have a simmering low intensity conflict in Ukraine taking place, but I do not say the situation escalating any further. And in due course, probably unless there is some wild card kind of a scenario that there is an assassination attempt or things of that nature, or there is a coup kind of a thing, I don't think that Russia is going to dissipate, or it is going to fragment, or there's going to be an implosion of. Even if that happens, it doesn't affect India. You know, we are dependent on certain spares on India. We are only taking about less than 1% of our energy requirements from India. What have we done? We purchased about 13 million barrels of oil from them. So even for our energy security and our critical spares, Indian military is not going to come to a grinding halt. And that is why our people made a very wise choice of diversifying our defense needs. So I think somebody else will come and fill the vacuum. And the geopolitical situation is not such that should Russia tank, China is looking for an opportunity, Pakistan is looking for an opportunity to attack India. India is not a pushover. So I do not subscribe to that kind of a scenario that you have articulated.
So you sound optimistic about Russian resilience. You talked about energy. Interestingly, you said someone else will fill the vacuum. So if Russia is not able to provide spare parts and supplies, do you see India turning to former Soviet satellites, or where might they find these things?
See, India has actually achieved a lot of proficiency in integration of technologies. We have Russian platforms on which we have Israeli systems, avionics. Similarly, we have systems from other European countries. So there is already that wherewithal which is available with us. And most of the most critical thing in our case is, say, Indian Air Force. Indian Air Force in any case is in the process of weeding out old platforms, and we are having Teja 1, Teja 2. Similarly, we have Rafales now. Likewise, you know, we are doing the indigenous production of some of these aircraft. We are also doing, you know, indigenous production of BrahMos and many other things. Maybe some of our modernization programs in terms of, you know, certain frigates or induction of another nuclear technology, nuclear submarine in the near term. These may actually receive a setback, but that is not going to impact India's defense preparedness in the long run. In the meanwhile, I'm sure that, well, American companies and American law will not be very fussy as in the past, put too many caveats of sharing this defense technology with India, so many ifs and buts. Probably that realization will also dawn upon Americans, and you will be little more liberal in giving us that technology to meet our needs. And that would be a very natural progression of our relations, because Russia is not able to fulfill its obligation, and America has come to the fore to fill up the vacuum, considering that we have a very live problem with the Chinese. And there is a huge sort of technology capability gap between us and Chinese. At the moment, all that help that we need from American companies is to help us in bridging or narrowing down that military technological capacity gap vis-a-vis China. And if you're prepared to do that, then our strategic partnership is going to further solidify.
Thank you, sir.
If I may interject very quickly. Christopher, we are getting a lot of questions from our Dutch friends, both in chat and the Q&A section. And there's a question, I'll read it out from Robert. And Robert is the defense attaché in New Delhi for the Netherlands. And he says, India needs Russia for a lot of reasons. Is there any reverse leverage? Does Russia need India? Can this be used to change their minds? I mean, we can go to Manu, who's had his hand raised, who's a partner at Fair Observer Intelligence, and he's the most intelligent one, apparently, except for the two senior people here. So we'll let him address this.
So first is regarding the question, whether Russia finds any use for India or not. But let's go back 30 years when Soviet Union broke up. Look at the top 10 economies. You hardly have mention of India. It's really loitering around in the teens, and then you had China. But now you have a situation in which the top 6 out of top 6 economies in the world, 3 are from Asia. So you have Japan, you have China, you have India. We can keep Japan out of it because obviously it's in the Western sphere of influence. But at least in terms of economic integration, Japan is, it may be a surprise to many, but it is actually closely integrated with the supply chains in China. And there is a mesh of cross investments and industrial transfer that goes on between Japan and China. And then you have, of course, India. So for Russia to basically ride out these sanctions, all it has to do is be in the good books of China and India. Why I say India? Because, one may say that in terms of GDP, India is 1/5 of China. But the correct way of looking at it would be to not look at the size, but to look at the leverage. That is, for example, if Russia was to lose or were to be pressurized over an X amount of trade vis-a-vis China, can India step up? Given the quantum of trade between Russia and China as of now, I think India can over the years, especially in what can be called mission critical industrial goods. Other than that, Russia is a fortress economy. It has minerals, it has food, it has fresh water. It has the basics sorted. And of course, it has a certain level of technological accomplishment, which allows it to remain an industrialized power, even if every major Western corporation were to stop doing business with them. So in that terms, Russia is a fortress economy. Worst comes to worst, they don't need anyone. But if they need to thrive, I think they can do that riding on a China leveraged with, let us say, 1/5 or a 1/4 sized India. That would be the first thing. And, just to broaden the point and taking off from where Major General Sharma was, that basically there are no heroes or villains. I mean, from what I'm getting from the ground, so at Fair Observer Intelligence, we have this empirical data tool in which we are able to monitor most major Indian languages. So that works out to be about, more than 75 to 80% of the population in the language they think and write about. So when we looked at it, we expected, that there will be an inverse relationship between the sentiment for Russia and the West. That is, if people were to like Russia, they would hate the West. Or if they were to hate, one, they would like the other one, so on and so forth. Incidentally, what we found was that there was a positive correlation, meaning that both EU, in this case, we are holding back the US numbers for the clients, but both EU and Russia were going down together in net sentiment and rising together in net sentiment month on month, both before the war, right during, March and January and Feb, and then now. So what that tells us is that at least amongst the masses, and I'm not talking the classes as of now, I'm not talking the policymakers in Lutyens Delhi, but beyond, at least amongst the masses, the idea is that, it's a fight between two power centers and they're really concerned about their own interests. We don't have much to contribute to it. So this is just elaborating, so when Major General Sharma says that India wasn't consulted, I think the broader voting electorate also perhaps shares this sentiment. Just to give you an example, people talk about, war being right at the doors of EU, that Russia brought war back to Europe after so many years. But it's also interesting to note that the closest Afghan border to Indian territory is, I think, Jalalabad border as the crow flies from somewhere in Rajouri and Poonch, and the distance would be 250 odd kilometers. Now, when you have people falling off the planes in a country that's that close to you, but it doesn't make any ripple across the world, then it's actually quite normal to expect that things further afar may perhaps not register as well as perhaps the voting electorate in the West may want it to.
Thank you. And Atul, I was going to ask you the question that we had from Robert about whether or not India has any reverse leverage with Russia. He goes on to state or ask, does Russia need India? Can this be used to change their minds? Atul?
Well, I think India has some, but not immense leverage with Russia. China has much greater leverage because they are building the big pipeline. So with the pipeline to Germany scuppered, and you and I were together partying with the Germans only 2 days ago, and the mood in Germany has shifted, even though the German president has been snubbed, in my view, extremely unwisely by the Ukrainian president. But the point is that the mood in Germany has shifted, and even though they have inflation skyrocketing, even though they do not have ports to get the gas from the US, they've said no to the pipeline. And so now this big Power of Siberia pipeline will give China monumental quantities of gas. So the leverage we have is much more limited. And Robert's question, in fact, Yarst, our naval attaché friend in Washington, D.C., his questions are tie into this as well. India's leverage with Russia is limited. India wants an end to the war. Inflation in an energy-dependent country that imports almost all of its oil is terrible for the economy and terrible for the political party in power generally. And so India is constantly talking to Russia to sort of dial it down in back channels. That is what I've been led to believe. That is what my friends, both in political and diplomatic circles, tell me. So India is doing its bit for peace, and India is exerting its leverage, but it doesn't have that much leverage as China. And Russia right now, as we know, has lost face, and emotion has got the better of both Ukraine and Russia, frankly. And now any kind of peace deal will be difficult, because how can a Ukrainian president who's snubbing a German president, which is a big power, suddenly turn around and say, we are willing to give up, forget Donetsk or Luhansk, we are even willing to give up Crimea. So similarly, Russia, after its tanks have been decimated, now is in this let's redeem ourselves phase. And look, the general now heading the operations is the chap who was active in Syria. Clearly, there has been a replacement. Clearly, heads have rolled in Russian military. So I think given the internal compulsions and the external considerations for Russia, leverage is limited. And that is why, India, is not pushing it too far. And Yarst, our dear friend, is talking very much about the UN Charter in respect of territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. And India is just staying neutral, because India has found that when it comes to the violation of its own integrity and its own sovereignty, the US and the UK have gone missing. They have backed Pakistan. In fact, let's take it a bit further. The entire discourse in the New York Times and the Washington Post is about India being a Hindu fascist state. Now, this Hindu fascist state just sent 50,000 tons of wheat to Muslim Taliban-led Afghanistan, where a plane was hijacked in 1999 and led to much trauma on the Indian national psyche. None other than Jaswant Singh, the former foreign minister himself, flew down with 3 hostages who've then gone on to have glorious careers in terror. So the point is that with India, there is this feeling, yes, we don't want the sovereignty and integrity of any state to be impinged upon. And we want peace because otherwise inflation is going to kill our poor. But we don't like this double standard wherein we are constantly accused of human rights abuses. We are constantly told that we are a Hindu fascist country, even though we sent wheat to Afghanistan, which was abandoned by the US. And we are lectured to and moralized. And I think that is the Indian conundrum, because there's also this feeling that Ukraine matters to the Europeans because it's next door and people are white. And Afghanistan or Yemen or Tigray doesn't matter because, of course, it's the non-white world. So there's a trust deficit. And I think over a period of time, if that trust was built up, and if those relations were built up, particularly in trade and technology transfer, then India would be far more supportive of the Western stand and the normative stand, which India buys into, by the way. India is not really a revisionist power, unlike China or Russia. But India believes that the liberal world order cannot be frozen in 1945. That's when World War II ended and we weren't independent. So India wants a seat at the Security Council. India wants a greater reflection of its rise in the international institutions. And barring that, as long as there's a perception that the West is always going to hold a glass ceiling for India, there'll be less sympathy for the Western point of view and Western sensibilities and Western interests.
And in our closing moments, I see we have a question pursuant to what you were saying about technology. It says India, there is entry into the military industrial field of Indian companies. As they grow and enter into deals with US companies, could this soften US companies' reluctance to share technology? And how does that relate to the long term for defense cooperation matters?
Eventually, there'll be closer relations with the US because there are cultural similarities. Both are messy, chaotic democracies. Both are divided. There's a lot of noise, particularly in both countries' media. But eventually, given the fact, I mean, just take a simple example. Most of the top Indian industrialists, their children have studied in Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, the usual suspects. So many middle-class children are all studying in University of Urbana-Champaign. These are universities that aren't that well known even in the US, or for that matter, even in Oxford, Mississippi. So the point is that given the fact that the youth in India are studying in America or studying as per the American model, increasingly the IITs, all the faculty have done their PhDs. Not all, but a vast majority have done their PhDs in the US. The private universities that are coming up have the 4-year undergrad model. They are modeled on the US. Culturally, you look at what Indians watch and see. So there is a closer, the ships are moving in a certain direction as there is cultural familiarity. There will be more engagement, and maybe it'll be a two-way process. Maybe we'll have something to share when it comes to drones. Maybe we'll have something to share as well as to how to do innovation on the cheap. Maybe you'll build our ships in our docks because your labor costs are too high.
Well, thank you for that. The Dutch and the Germans will be very appreciative. We're going to finish right on time, spot on. I want to thank all of you gentlemen, or as we say in Texas, all y'all, for showing up. And this concludes our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.